Today we're unboxing an iPad Air 2 that's been sealed in its box for nearly 11 years. I found this one on eBay. It was actually an auction and I won it for only $91 plus shipping. Taking a look around the box here, you'll see that this still has the original shrink wrap applied. It does show some slight scratches and wear, so I definitely think this seal is authentic. On the front here, we see the really thin profile of the iPad Air 2. And this one is in the silver color option. Here on the back, we do see a slight tear in the film. And this is the base 16GB storage option. Also, I checked the serial number of this device and found out it was produced in October of 2014. So this should definitely be running its original software version, iOS 8. I'm only going to cut this back sheet of plastic off so I can kind of retain a sealed appearance from the front. And there we go. Now that that is removed, we should be able to just lift open the box. And there we go. We can now see our silver iPad Air 2. We'll use this pull tab to lift it up. And there we go. It's looking perfect so far. Thankfully, it does not appear that the battery has bloated. And now we'll take a look at the back panel. So now let's go ahead and pull this tab to release the iPad from its envelope. And there we go. It does appear that the iPad has somewhat of a film or a residue on the display, but that can easily be wiped off and everything else is looking perfect. So now for the really nerve-wracking part, let's get this iPad connected to power and see if the battery will charge up. Okay, well, I did get an Apple logo for a second, but then the charging logo has appeared. Seeing the Apple logo right away was a little bit troubling because sometimes if devices have been sealed and the battery goes bad, they go into a boot loop. And that's basically when the Apple logo keeps flashing in a cycle because the battery is not able to receive a charge. But thankfully we are getting the charging screen here, so I'll set the iPad to the side and we'll take a look at the accessories. So first we'll take a look at the literature packet here. And this includes a really basic quick start guide as well as some regulatory info and 2 Apple stickers. We also have a power adapter here, so we'll check the wattage on this. And it looks like this one is a 10 watt. Lastly here we have our Lightning to USB-A cable. So now we'll just leave the iPad to charge up and I'll resume the video when it's ready. Okay, and I now have the iPad Air 2 here all charged up. I had this connected to a 12 watt power adapter and it actually turned on in only about 15 minutes. But it took around 5 hours to become fully charged. From this hello screen that it booted into, we can definitely tell that it's running iOS 8. First off, this slide to setup interface was only used through iOS 9. But what gives it away as iOS 8 is this font. So certain details of this font, like the extended tail on the letter A, means this is Helvetica New. And that was only used through iOS 8 as Apple switched to their in-house design font called San Francisco with iOS 9. And that font distinctively uses a flat tail for the letter A. So anyway, let's go ahead and slide to setup now. And awesome, it looks like we have easily made it through activation. And there we go, we are met with the iOS 8 home screen and a prompt to update to iOS 15, which we will definitely not be doing. Right off the bat, I'm going to disconnect from Wi-Fi and then head into settings so we can see which version of iOS 8 we have. And awesome, that's what we like to see. This is running the very first version of iOS 8 available for this model. So that is iOS 8.1 because this model was released about 1 month into iOS 8's life cycle. And we also do get confirmation here for the 16GB capacity. That's really the only bummer about this device. I do wish it was the higher end 64 or 128GB option. And this iOS 8 home screen just looks so good. I love this default wallpaper and the fact that we have the older red music icon here. Apple replaced the red music icon with a white one in iOS 8.4 to align with the launch of their streaming service, Apple Music. And it's kind of funny because the red music icon would actually return years later in iOS 14. So now let's take a second to talk about what the iPad Air 2 was. This model was released in October of 2014 alongside the iPad Mini 3. And it's pretty funny because the Mini 3 here was one of the worst year-over-year upgrades ever. But the Air 2 here was one of the best ever, so it rightfully got much more attention. It was released about 1 month after the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. And as the successor to the 2013 first generation iPad Air, this model really made important upgrades in pretty much every area you can think of. So first off, we'll talk about the design. The Air 2 was significantly thinner than the original. More specifically, the Air 2 was 19% thinner, at 6.1 millimeters instead of the original Air's 7.5. Apple compared the thickness of the original Air to a pencil, but for the Air 2, they had some really cool ads of slicing a pencil almost down the middle. Also, the Air 2 was lighter, so the original weighed in at 1.034 pounds, but the Air 2 here was only 0.96. So just 30 grams of difference, but it really was noticeable. And while the actual display panel resolution was the same, measuring 9.7 inches diagonally with a resolution of 2048 by 1536, it now featured some really premium qualities that made it so much more impressive. So first off, the panel itself was now laminated to the cover glass. So not only did that help make the device thinner, it also made the content feel so much more immersive, as there was no longer an air gap between the component that you actually touch and the display. There was also now an anti-reflective coating on the Air 2. So in certain lightings that almost has like a blue or purple tint, but it really does help cut down on reflections. So for a comparison here, we'll bring in the original Air. This one almost functions like a mirror compared to the Air 2. So especially outdoors or really anywhere near a light source, this iPad offered a much better experience. And not to get ahead of myself here, but the anti-reflective coating and laminated display is something that Apple is still gatekeeping in their lineup in 2025. So if you purchase a base model iPad today, it will not have those features. Of course, that model is quite a bit cheaper than what the Air 2 here launched at, and this was positioned to be Apple's flagship model at the time. But you would just think that Apple could finally make that a standard feature after offering it somewhere in the lineup for over 10 years. Another big upgrade for the Air 2 here was the addition of this Touch ID fingerprint sensor. That had launched back in 2013 on the iPhone 5S, and it was one of the biggest complaints about the original Air that it was not an included feature. So we'll go into settings here to set that up. This setup process is so nostalgic for me. I remember I definitely did not have a device with Touch ID at the time. So if I could get my hands on a device that had it, I love to go through this setup process. Everyone is super used to Touch ID today, but back then it felt like absolutely something from the future. So let's unlock this device with Touch ID for the very first time. And as you can see, it operates really quick and seamlessly. This was not the second generation Touch ID sensor that would come on the 2015 iPhone 6s, but it did operate slightly quicker than other devices like the iPad Mini 3. You could add up to 5 fingerprints, which that's actually another nostalgic point for me. Because using this feature, you could actually add entire different people's fingerprints. And Touch ID actually launched when I was in middle school, so I remember it was very exclusive if someone would let you add your fingerprint to their device. But anyway, of course you could use that feature to unlock the device. You could also use it to make iTunes and App Store purchases. And something I'm pretty sure that was exclusive to this model alongside the iPhone 6 was Apple Pay. Okay, wow, and I've just discovered something that I've never known about Touch ID. So while in this panel, if you rest a finger that is registered on the sensor, it will actually highlight it. That's so cool. I don't know how I've never noticed that before. But that's a really cool feature because especially if you were adding multiple, it was a good idea to go in here and name them. So like right thumb, left index, things like that. Also new for the iPad Air 2 was the addition of a gold color option. That had launched on the iPhone back in 2013 and it was a really popular finish at the time. And although I don't have that option here, I'm still really happy to have the silver. These old devices with white display bezels are super nostalgic to me. As Apple no longer makes these, I believe the only device with a white bezel is the current iMac. And a few more points about the design of this iPad Air 2. The cutouts for this speaker design was much more reminiscent of what was on the iPhone 6. So just a single row of cutouts. Whereas on the original Air there was 2 rows. Also, the volume rocker design here was more similar to the iPhone 6 with this recessed cutout. And there was no longer a physical switch for the rotation lock or mute like the original iPad Air had. Instead, you could access that in the control center. And this iPad got a huge improvement to the internal specs. So it was now powered by a triple-core A8X processor. It was the first and only iOS device to have that 3-core processor, as Apple would return to dual-core the following year. It was also the first iOS device to include 2 gigabytes of RAM. So as expected, this model performed incredibly well and it was very future-proofed. It ended up receiving a huge amount of software support through iOS, or rather iPadOS 15 in 2021. And that version has received some pretty recent security updates, so it's still somewhat usable in 2025. Also, the rear camera on this model got an upgrade, so it was now an 8 megapixel sensor instead of 5. And it had some cool features like HDR as well as slow-mo video. There was also an improved dual microphone setup where they would flank the camera. You could get your iPad Air 2 here in 16, 64, or 128 gigabytes of storage. And it launched at the typical flagship iPad price of $499. You could also step up to a cellular model for $130 extra. And Apple sold this model for quite some time. It did kind of take a step back from being the flagship though when Apple launched both sizes of the iPad Pro in 2015 and 16. They ended up bumping the base storage on this to 32 gigabytes in 2016. And it was discontinued altogether with the release of the 5th generation iPad in March of 2017. And now let's turn our attention to iOS 8 on this device specifically. So this was understandably a relatively small update, as iOS 7 had just brought a full redesign the previous year. But there were still some pretty cool changes. So continuity and handoff were new, and those were really valuable features, especially when it came to getting work done across multiple devices in your Apple ecosystem. Also, there were some more options for widgets in the iOS 8 notification center. And there was a simplified design with Today and Notifications. With iOS 7, there was a third category called Mist. And as you can see here, there was a new application for iOS 8 called Tips. Unfortunately, even with Wi-Fi, this will not load, but it basically would instruct you how to use different features of the UI. The iBooks application was now included on this version by default, as well as the Podcasts app. There was a new feature in the keyboard for this version called QuickType. So that would give you suggested words across the top of your keyboard. There was now a recently deleted folder in Photos, and the control center had a slightly revised look. Here's what it looked like with iOS 7. There was also now a timer feature in the camera application, and the multitasking view would now feature your recent contacts across the top. One of the biggest downfalls for iOS 8 is that it didn't really provide great useful multitasking features for powerful devices like this. So with the following version, iOS 9, Apple would give us features like slide over and split screen multitasking. Now let's try out Siri here on iOS 8. What's the weather like in New York City right now?
It's currently partly cloudy and 75 degrees in New York.
Show me MLB scores.
Here are the results from the MLB for yesterday.
And there we go, Siri is working pretty much seamlessly on iOS 8. We'll also try and pull up the App Store. And yes, it loads without any issue. This is currently the oldest version of the App Store that allows you to actually sign in and download applications. It's a little bit of a process. You have to go in through your Purchase tab here. And the first time you sign in, it will tell you that your password is wrong. But it will send a 6-digit security code to your other devices. You then just sign in one more time, but put that 6-digit code at the end of your password. And by going through that process, you'll be able to download prior versions of applications that are compatible with iOS 8. The 16 gigabytes of storage on these is pretty limiting, especially because I also like to sync a portion of my iTunes library. But I'll still be able to get the classics that I love playing on these, like Temple Run and Grand Theft Auto. We'll also take a look here at the default wallpaper selection for iOS 8. And this is definitely one of my favorite wallpaper selections for any legacy iOS version. First off, we have the dynamic category. These were carried over from iOS 7. And you had 7 choices here, all with dots that would move according to the tilt of your device. And next up, we have a legendary selection of stills. So there are 43 here to choose from. A lot of these were new for iOS 8, but a good amount were carried over from iOS 7. So here is a look at the rest of those. Of course, the purple space image with the snowy mountain was the default. We also have this underwater image. This was actually used for the iOS 8 beta versions. And these flower images were pretty interesting. These were highly used in marketing for the iPhone 6. So this was commonly used for the space gray model, this was for the gold, and this was often used for the silver. And you really cannot go wrong with any of these choices, they all look so good. I think for this model though, I am going to leave the default. So that pretty much concludes my look at this iPad Air 2 that's been sealed in its box since 2014. It always amazes me that these devices can sit in a box for over 10 years and then be powered up like nothing happened. This is definitely one of my favorite legacy iPads alongside the first generation iPad Pro models running iOS 9. But this Air 2 really was a legendary device. So leave me a comment below with your thoughts and be sure to get subscribed for more sealed iOS device unboxing videos. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one.